All right. Well, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started here. And welcome to our session today, which is called PPP Funding Management and Getting Back to Work. My name is Corey Claiborne. I'm the Executive Vice President of AIA Virginia and proud to serve each and every one of you. I think some of you joined us last month for our Navigating the CARES Act. And if you did, some of these faces here will be familiar, particularly from O'Hagan and Meyer. And they're with us here today, as well as some of our partners from the Virginia Society of CPAs to bring you this session here. Really proud of the partnership that we have with O'Hagan and Meyer. They have really proven to be such a valuable resource to our organization and our members as we navigate this pandemic. And I want to make sure before we get started that I share with you just a couple of things at AIA Virginia that we're taking on right now to hopefully position you to be a member of great value to not only your clients, but also to others within your firm. And so, but probably about a month ago, we started a retainer with O'Hagan Meyer through AIA Virginia. And in return, each principal in each firm has access to a free 30-minute consultation to help you navigate through any issue regarding the pandemic. So that could be employment law, it could be just understanding the federal legislation, the do's and don'ts of a PPP versus an EIDL loan, whatever it may be. But I want to make sure that you know that as a member, you have access to that benefit and a great benefit. And so when you use that benefit, you'll just bill against my retainer at AIA Virginia. And this is something that we can continue well beyond the pandemic as a great member benefit. Also, I want you to know that our COVID-19 page on our website is always and continuously being updated. As such, we just added a brand new section called For Your Clients, which consists of resources that we hope will position you to be a value add to your client relationships. So there's things on there such as tools to help your clients reopen. There's also a document from Johns Hopkins University that was sent to all the governors to help them in their decision-making processes. All of that is on that web page. And again, it's easily laid out and it's called For Your Clients. Again, hopefully to position you to be a value add to that relationship. As we move on today, I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. If you could keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation, that'd be very, very helpful. If you do need to speak during the Q&A, you can always just push the space bar and hold that. And that's the way that you can temporarily unmute yourself. The other piece, if you don't feel like speaking during the Q&A, you can always submit your questions through the Zoom group chat box. For most control panels, if you scroll down to the bottom, the chat box icon is a little bubble right in the middle of your screen, in the middle of your toolbar, usually located at the bottom of your screen. We'll be keeping an eye on that throughout so we can try to get through all the questions. We may not be able to get through some, but if there's some that we don't hit, again, we have the free 30-minute consultation for you that you can use. And so you can feel free to reach out if you're an AIA member. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the man of the hour, our moderator, Charlie Meyer. And Charlie is the co-founder of the firm, O'Hagan Meyer. His practice focuses on employment litigation and counseling, and he represents employers in a wide variety of employment litigation matters, including defense of wrongful discharge claims, breach of employment contracts and restrictive covenants, disability discrimination claims under the ADA, age discrimination claims under the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, actions filed under the Family Medical Leave Act and Fair Labor Standards Act, and claims of unlawful harassment and race and gender discrimination under Title VII, Section 1981. All that to say is that this man does a lot of things and he's an expert in many areas. Prior to joining O'Hagan Meyer, Charlie was the vice president and shareholder of LeClaire Ryan, where he chaired the firm's labor and employment practice team. He has been selected for the best lawyers in America under the labor and employment category and Virginia Business Magazine's Legal Elite. He also serves on the board of the Virginia Chamber of Commerce and on the Chamber's Management and Relations Committee. And so I hope you can see just by that introduction the value of the folks I'll be serving on this panel here. These are some real sharp individuals, experts in their fields. So with that, Charlie, I'm going to get out of the way and I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, my friend. Take us away.
Thank you, Corey, so much for that very kind introduction. Really appreciate it. And at O'Hagan Meyer, we really appreciate the opportunity to partner with AIA Virginia and in particular on this topic of PPP loan forgiveness under the CARES Act, and then the seminal issue of getting back to work. We have a great panel, and I want to give a shout out to our partnership with Dixon Hughes Goodman. Two of our four panelists are managing directors at Dixon Hughes. Wesley Allen, managing director of Dixon Hughes Goodman in their Charlotte, North Carolina office. And Bill Walter here in Virginia, he's managing director in their Tysons, Virginia office. And they have played a critical role in navigating PPP loans for their clients over the past several weeks. And we thought it would be critical to bring them to this conversation. We're really happy to have them. In addition to Wesley and Bill, I have two of my partners, Joan McKenna, who's an employment lawyer here in our Richmond, Virginia office, and Woody Lay, who's managing partner of our Charlotte office, also a licensed Virginia bar member, who, like Joan and myself, is a seasoned employment lawyer who's been navigating a number of these claims and issues, not only over the past few weeks, but frankly, his entire career. So here's our proposed agenda, just so everyone has a sense. We're roughly going to break this program into two parts. First part is the PPP loan part, because there are a number of hot questions. And as Corey said, if questions pop up that we're not addressing, go to the chat box and submit it. And we'll take a break halfway through and get to some of those questions. And we'll also revisit some new questions at the end of the program. So the first half will be the PPP program, and the second half will be how do you get your workforce back to work? So we spent a lot of time the last time we convened talking about furloughs and layoffs and complying with the Family First Coronavirus Response Act and some of the other federal legislation. And now we're at the point with Governor Northam opening up phase one last Friday for every locality with the exception of Richmond, Northern Virginia, and Accomack County on the Eastern Shore. How do you get back to work? How do you do it safely? So our topics are complying with the PPP program and ensuring your loan is forgiven, bringing your workforce back to work, how to comply with the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, and looking a little bit more in depth, if we have some time at the end, on the impact of the return to work in terms of the ADA and some of the specific regulations. Let's dive right in, though, with our panel to the CARES Act Paycheck Protection Program. And Woody, I'm gonna ask you to kick it off with this PPP certification update, because we've heard concerns from a number of PPP borrowers, including AIA members, who have had access to alternate funds, such as credit lines, for example. And the question is whether the certifications they made to obtain the loans were accurate and whether that will impact loan forgiveness under the PPP program. So could you briefly, Woody, give an overview on how do you address that concern, where you've got other lines of credit, what certifications our members have had to make, and what the Treasury has said about that in terms of the FAQ?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So when everybody got their loan forms and applied, well, you did it twice. When people applied for their PPP loan and when they completed the loan forms, you made a certification that in good faith, taking into account your current business activity and your ability to access other sources of liquidity sufficient to support the ongoing operations in a manner that is not significantly detrimental to the business, that was the reason why you needed the loan. And for a long time, there was a lot of concern, as most people probably saw in the press. There was a big uproar about large entities that were getting the PPP loans. And the Treasury Department kept putting out FAQs that would say, we're going to look at these certifications. This is a reminder that there are criminal penalties associated with making false certifications. And they would, and they put out FAQs that that weren't limited to large. They put out one for large public companies, and then they put out one that said this applies to everyone. And so as a result of that, it created a lot of angst as to, well, you know, what if I have a credit line that I could take advantage of? What if I have cash in a bank account that'll support me for a while and I'm really worried about the future? how does that all play out? And last week, the Treasury put out a FAQ 46 that said if your loan amount is under $2 million, then they're going to assume that you made that your entity, the borrower, made the certification in good faith. So that was good news for most everybody who had a loan. If your loan is over $2 million, as we'll talk about a little more in this program, you're going to be subject to audit, and they're going to look at whether those whether certification was in good faith, and you're going to have to, if they audit you, justify your need for the loan. So for everybody whose loan amount is under $2 million, that's not going to be an issue anymore. And on the $2 million issue, on the actual loan forgiveness form, there's a box that you have to check to self-disclose that your loan amount is over $2 million. And they've indicated they're going to audit those loans. Whether they do or not is up in the air, but that's what they're indicating at the moment.
Okay. So here's the main question everyone has, which is forgiveness. Can you explain, Woody, how, the basics of the PPP forgiveness calculation, and what does Section 1106 say about forgiveness, just so people have that framework?
Yeah, I'm gonna set it up and then turn it over to Bill. But for everybody who got the loan, you calculated your average monthly payroll cost, and you got 2.5 times that amount, or some calculation of that amount. The payroll costs are the same on the forgiveness side as it was to get the PPP loan in the first place. So it's salary, wages, commissions, capped at $100,000 for anyone making more than that. Vacation, parental, family, medical, and sick leave, severance payments where applicable, group health care payments, 401k payments, interest on mortgage obligations incurred before February 15th, rent incurred before February 15th, and utilities. Now, for forgiveness, the forgiveness calculation is the 8 weeks after the money hits your account, and you can only get forgiven 75% of it, of your PPP loan amount has to be spent on payroll, and 25% of it can be spent on non-payroll amounts. And that's what you'll need for your forgiveness. And then I'll turn it over to Bill to pick it up from there and talk about the other aspects of the forgiveness calculation.
Okay, thanks, Woody. And the forgiveness calculation, as you said, it starts with the payroll number. What is the amount that you spent on payroll using the same definition that you used to get the loan for the gross payroll costs? And it also includes healthcare, and it also includes retirement payments that are made. So under the Act itself, when it came out, it actually provided a little bit of confusing guidance, because it said that the beginning forgiveness amount is going to be based on amounts that are accrued and payments made during the payment period. So later today, we'll talk about what some of the guidance has come out with to kind of clarify that a little bit, to make the accounting, we believe, a little bit easier, at least at the current point in time. But when you start out with that number for the payroll amount, the first adjustment they made is, as you said, Woody, it's the 75%. So if you have paid 26, 27, 28% of the loan proceeds to pay for rent, mortgage interest, stuff like that, well, the government's going to come in, and the first adjustment is going to be based on what is the amount over 25% that was used for other items. So that's going to be the first haircut that they make according to the law. The second adjustment they're going to make is they're going to take a look at your full-time equivalents during the first quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year, and they're going to say, okay, during the PPP period, what was your full-time equivalent headcount that you had? And if it's a reduction from a prior period, they do give you a couple of different numbers you get to work with, but if it's a reduction, they're going to adjust the amount that you can get back as well for the forgiveness. And then they also have a test that says, hey, if you have somebody and to keep people on board, you just put a reduction in wages going across the board. If that reduction in wages is more than 25% of what the person made at the start of the year, well, they're going to adjust your PPP forgiveness for that as well. And there's also an adjustment if you're in a seasonal industry, beaches where you may have a restaurant at the beach or things like that. So if you have seasonal employees, there's some additional steps that can be taken, but those are kind of the key elements of what's going to be forgiven and how that's going to be calculated. And we'll get into more when we talk about the new form that just came out this week.
Bill, one of the issues is Treasury keeps coming out with different FAQs and other information. Can you provide the AIA members a little bit of guidance on what's the latest update from Treasury in terms of the FAQs and guidance in terms of calculating the loan forgiveness or other aspects of the PPP loan? Any insights in terms of the latest guidance?
I'd love to. A lot of my practice is focused on companies that do business with the government, state governments, federal governments, whatever. And with that, we've got a lot of additional guidance as to how they're going to be measuring it. But working with Wesley, we have a task force that gets together every morning for an hour to kind of talk through what are the new updates, what are the new regulations. And being in a world with government contracting, I'm used to changes all the time, but it's fun watching the rest of our partners and managers who are involved in this that are coming across it the first time. So the first thing I want to chat about real quickly is a thing called an interim final rule. This is something that we don't see too often. It's when there's a big push to get information out, but it doesn't have time to go through the whole bureaucratic process from the federal government, to go through the Federal Register, to go through all the different rulemaking bodies. So here the SBA has actually issued about a dozen interim final rules. They seem to come out with one about every 3-4 days. So if you get a chance, go to the SBA website. The interim final rules are listed there. Take a look at the first one, because that one does deal with forgiveness. And it goes inside and it gives us a couple of elements that explain, kind of in very broad terms, how the forgiveness can be made, who can get forgiveness, etc. But that interim final rule is the predecessor, and I would say that one's kind of been overtaken by the new form we're going to be talking about in just a few minutes. The Department of Treasury also has a website, and there they have their FAQs on the PPP loans. And when we take a look at that, they've got question number 16 deals directly with what can be forgiven, how can it be forgiven. And in there, what they're talking about is initially gross payroll. We had questions, well, do I have to adjust for taxes that get taken out of the employee's paychecks or not? So there's clarification on what that means. And the Treasury Department provided some very favorable guidance for most people on that. Question number 20 says, okay, we got this PPP. We know it's an 8-week period. When does it start? So I think Charlie mentioned early on, or Woody, I can't remember which of you, that it starts when the proceeds enter your account. So these FAQs are something that it's worth looking at, because it will certainly help you. And there's another question in there about, well, what if I have somebody who's out on a temporary duty station and I pay them $1,000 a month of a stipend? How does that fit into the mix? Well, the guidance says, well, that's included as gross wages. So some good advice there that we get through those frequently asked questions, and also through the interim final rules. Dealing with contracts. If you have contracts with the Department of Defense, with the Department of Transportation, with any of the federal or state agencies, they're kind of looking at this PPP to make sure it doesn't double dip. So you don't get paid for the work you did and you don't get this money back. I'm not going to go into details on that because we just don't have enough time. But if you are working with an agency, take a look on their website and see if they have guidance, because I've got the guidance from the Department of Defense, from the super secret agencies, and all sorts of other groups. And I will tell you one thing: you think PPP is hard, just take a look at how the government's implementing it. It's inconsistent across all groups, and even within the Department of Defense, it's different with every branch of the service. So they're trying to get that done. In fact, one of the other big challenges is part of the CARES Act. It provides for contractors to, if you have people on a standby because the base is closed down, you can actually apply to get paid for the people who are sitting on standby. And that's under Section 3610 of the CARES Act. So if you are looking for something like that, if you have programs with your client or with your customers that are tied to a government agency, there's another opportunity to be able to get some compensation. The reason I mention that is because it does say if you get your loan forgiven, that amount that you request for equitable adjustments kind of has to be tossed back to the agency. You can't double dip on that.
Bill, that's really helpful. So going back to the SBA website, the first interim final rule pertains directly to loan forgiveness. And then going to the Treasury website, FAQ, Q number 16 and Q number 20 pertain to loan forgiveness. But you tipped your hat that this past Friday, Treasury came out with a new form, and that maybe supersedes even the earlier SBA rule on loan forgiveness. Can you walk us through this new Treasury form that just came out on Friday and the mechanics of the forgiveness process that they lay out there?
I'd be happy to. And the form, if you go on to the different websites, Small Business Administration, Department of Treasury, you can find this. And it's called the Paycheck Protection Program Loan Forgiveness Application. And basically, it's an 11-page document, okay? And it starts out repeating some of the definitions that are in an FAQ or in the law or in the interim final rule that came in. And then it actually goes through the mechanics of how this whole thing is going to work. And it actually has a form number that actually, yeah, it's the form 3508. So if you're looking for this and you just want to go find it, just Google SBA form 3508. And this is the application. And it goes through and tells you, here's the types of things that you need to consider. It goes through the things that Woody started out with. It goes through the full-time equivalent and the salary adjustments that I spoke about briefly, and kind of gives you, this is the mechanical path, just like a tax form. Start out with your gross number at the top. Here's the adjustments at the bottom. There's a little safe harbor thing at the bottom for head counts that you can go through.
So Bill, what kind of certifications do the AIA members need to submit when they fill out this form 3508 for loan forgiveness?
Okay. Well, if you take a look at this, the certification is very comparable to the one you had to sign for the loan and the one that Woody talked about earlier. You're going to certify and attest to the amount of the loan that you're requesting forgiveness for, that you're entitled to it. You're going to attest to the forms that you're providing, because you may have to provide payroll forms, tax forms, other pieces of information. So you're certifying to the accuracy of the completeness of that information. You're certifying that you gave the lender all of the information that you have to be able to help them make their forgiveness determination. So it's a pretty substantial certification when it comes in.
So the next question follows, which is, okay, when does everyone have to do this? I mean, what's the timeline, Bill, for submitting this loan forgiveness application?
And I wish I had the right answer for you on that, but there is no answer. The form itself expires on October 31st of 2020. So hopefully you think maybe before the form expires, we'd want to have it in. But the act itself, the guidance that's come out, doesn't really have a date in there. Some of the banks that we've worked with, I've seen on their note, it'll identify that you have to have this in within 12 weeks. So you've got your 8-week period, then they give you 4 weeks to do the forgiveness calculation and get it in. Most companies they don't want to sit on this for a year. I mean, this is money that you're going to be able to get forgiven. So I would say companies should start working on this today and be prepared as soon as the 8-week period is over to be able to get that form in and get the loan forgiven.
That's excellent. Thank you, Bill. Wesley, on the same form, as you've looked at it, studied it, talked to your clients about it, are there any surprises with this form, Wesley, compared to how you previously understood loan forgiveness would work?
Yeah, the form did provide a number of helpful clarifying comments and clarifying instructions. One that we found the most surprising was, as Bill mentioned, there's reductions built into the Act for reductions to forgiveness built into the Act for full-time equivalent employees that if those numbers are lower versus comparable periods, we had expected, and many commentators had expected that to be based on a 30-hour week. They came out and based that on a 40-hour week. And the 30-hour week, there was some basis to that. The FTE was not defined directly in Section 1106, but in separate sections of the Act, specifically Section 2301, when it discussed the employee retention credit, it referred to qualified wages of an employee that was eligible for that credit, and referred specifically to Section 4980H, which is the Obamacare section of the Act, and at the same time, you couldn't use the employee retention credit and use the PPP funds. You couldn't have both. So there was some a lot of thought put into perhaps 30 hours, but it ended up being 40 hours. And then there's a few other items, but that to me was the most unexpected when it came out.
Okay. What does the form say about paid and incurred payroll versus non-payroll costs? Because we know about the 75-25% split. How does the form unpack that?
Yeah, so again, here there was some helpful guidance, and Bill referred to this as well. The Act itself, it said costs incurred and payments made, and that was the language. So it caused a lot of confusion as to whether or not small business taxpayers or small business owners, which have historically not done accrual accounting, were going to have to implement accrual accounting. So when the form actually came out, it does segregate. It uses the term payroll costs paid and payroll costs incurred when it's talking about payroll costs. And similarly with non-payroll costs, it says non-payroll costs must be paid or incurred. And our interpretation of that is that it's giving you essentially a cash basis assessment up front, and then it also opens an opportunity for an accrual basis at the end. So on the front end, if it's a payroll cost paid, you pay a payroll after the beginning of the covered period. Our interpretation of that is it's counted even if the payroll that you're paying was perhaps incurred slightly before the beginning of the covered period. Then at the end of the covered period, what it says is it states that payroll costs that are incurred, which is defined as being earned by the day that it's earned by the employee. So payroll costs incurred but not paid at the last pay period, as long as those costs are paid on or before the next regular pay date, those costs are eligible for forgiveness as well. So it to us, it's a favorable determination in terms of how they're currently defining that. They also go on to say, and they make a clarifying point that says, payroll costs incurred and paid should only be counted once. So that particular clarifying point seems to indicate that there's the opportunity to have some costs in there, perhaps on the front end that were paid but not necessarily incurred. On the non-payroll costs, the language says it's a cash paid type basis, but it also says paid on or before the next regular billing date if the cost is incurred. So again, at the end of it, there's an accrual type method, or perhaps I don't want to use the term prepayment, but there's an opportunity to get those costs that are incurred that you don't necessarily have a bill for that you're going to pay in the near future. So and I say all that with always in the back of our head that, as Bill mentioned, the FAQs and the interim final rules continue to come out, but at this point in time, that's what it appears to say.
Thank you, Wesley. This may be getting a little bit in the weeds, but what is the alternative payroll covered period? That's one question that surfaced.
Yeah, so what they were trying to accomplish here was to make it a little more administratively easy to get your payroll information and submit that for forgiveness. So what it says is for payroll only, you can start your payroll covered period to allow for forgiveness on the first day following the first payroll beginning after the loan origination date. So if you originate your loan on 4/20, your next payroll begins 4/26, your alternative payroll covered period starts 4/26 and goes for 56 days or 8 weeks. There is one limitation here where it limits the use of the alternative payroll covered period to those that have a biweekly or more frequent payroll schedule. So if you do it twice, if you pay twice a month or you pay once a month, it doesn't appear that you can use that method. But if you perhaps have 2 different payroll methods. Say you pay hourly employees biweekly, but you pay others monthly. It remains to be seen, but it does say, you know, if you have a biweekly, implying that if you pay under some sort of a hybrid, off-cycle method for different classes of employees, as long as you have a biweekly payroll schedule, you could use this method. Again, more clarity is needed, but that's what the alternative payroll covered period will allow you to do.
So another category, Wesley, and I know a number of the AIA members fall in this category, they're owners. So how is owner compensation treated?
So owner compensation is treated the way the act or the way the forgiveness form came out is it set aside this line 9 on the Schedule A worksheet or Schedule A that talks about where you enter any amounts paid to owners, and it put in language that says, you know, this amount's capped at $15,385 for each individual, or the 8-week equivalent of their applicable compensation in 2019, whichever is lower. And so this is a continuation, and the step here refers to the interim final rule, I believe it was number 3, that came out in April 2014, talking about owner compensation replacement and essentially limiting owner compensation replacement to the average of 8-week period during 2019 of net profit. So it refers specifically to line 31 on Schedule C, and limiting if you were a sole proprietor or a self-employed individual general partner. The way that guidance was implemented was to apply for the loan, you had to fill out a Schedule C of some sort, so you could get line 31 and figure out what the 2.5 times payroll cost or owner compensation replacement number was. So owner compensation is treated a little bit differently there, and has a limitation built into it versus regular employees.
So here's an issue, and this kind of dovetails in with the next part of the program we'll get to shortly, and that's the issue about, all right, we want to keep our workforce, but we've cut costs, we've cut our wages, we've reduced salaries. Has there been any clarification made regarding salary or hourly wage reduction and loan forgiveness? So say you cut it, everyone to 80% of what they were making before, just so that you didn't have to lay people off. But what does the form say about that, if anything?
Yeah, so there's two hits. Well, there's 3 hits you'll take. There's the 75%, then there's the salary hourly wage reduction, then there's the FTE calculation reduction. And it clarified on that point that one important clarification was how was the salary reduction going to be calculated? Was it going to start with those employees that you paid in Q1, and then if that employee was not there during the covered period, you get a wage reduction for that? There was that potential, but it came out and clarified that you start with employees that were employed during the covered period, and those are the individuals that you start with. And then it also made an important clarifying item with hourly employees, where the reduction is calculated based on their hourly rate, their hourly wage. The schedule is set up to take a per hour wage reduction and determine if that amount has been reduced by more than 75%. And as those, and if it exceeds 75%, then you multiply the differential between 75% and the actual by the number of hours average hours worked per week during the first quarter. So that was interesting in that if you have hourly employees, you could, in theory, reduce their hours, and that doesn't necessarily count against you on the hourly wage reductions, as long as you don't reduce their per hour wage. Where that will come back and hit you is in the FTE calculation, because the FTE calculation is based on the number of hours that the employee works. And in the FTE reduction calculation, other than the 40-hour per week item, that one ended up working out about as we expected. The reference periods are still the same. You compare your average FTEs during the covered period versus at your election 1/1/2020 through 2/29/2020, or 2/15/19 through 6/30/19, and compare against whichever one of those is lower. So that stayed the same. They did add administrative convention to allow you to count an employee. If they work more than 40 hours, you just count them as a 1 in the calculation. If they work less than 40, you don't necessarily have to accumulate their hours. You can just count them as a 0.5, which will make things a little bit easier. But we felt that those were important clarifying points, and shows that the intent not to hit you twice for wage reduction and FTEs.
That's helpful. Thank you, Wesley. Just a couple more questions on the PPP before we take a couple from the group. Bill, what kind of documentation do the AIA members need to submit for this loan forgiveness application? And you may have to come off of mute. If you can.
I can. Thank you. Sorry about that. And thank you, Paul. I thought you said I was talking too much, so I just had to take a step back. Basically, what they're looking for is documentation that shows that you made what the payroll costs were, so payroll reports. They want proof that you actually paid the payroll, so they want to see the proof of payment, whether it be a bank statement or whether it be some sort of a confirmation from the bank. And the same thing is with the non-payroll expenses. So for your rent, your utilities, whatever, they want to see the actual bills and they want to see the actual proof of payment. In addition to that, they want to see the schedule that Wesley was talking about where all the adjustments are. They do provide a couple of supplemental schedules that provide the detail with all the employee names, their last 4 of their social, et cetera. And that's if they call you, you need to have that information prepared and have it ready to go in. So primarily proof of payment and what are the amounts that you've included in here for forgiveness.
And Wesley, back to you. What happens to amounts that aren't forgiven? Yeah. In other words, how long do I have to pay back the balance that's not going to be forgiven?
Yeah, great question. So this was structured as a loan, as you know, all those folks, you signed a loan note. So this rolls into a note. The unforgiven amounts roll into a loan note. So at the end of this period, and the original act, I believe it said the term could be up to 5 years. The subsequent guidance from the SBA came out and said limit it to a maximum 2-year period. So the clock starts ticking the day your loan is dispersed, and you have 2 years from that date to repay those loan amounts. Clarifying that, so interest starts day one on the entire loan amount. When you get to the forgiveness point, any interest that's accrued on that forgiven amount, you don't ultimately have to pay. But the part that remains as unforgiven and rolled into a note, you pay interest on that from day one. And then you have 2 years from the date of origination to pay that balance off. As far as how long do we have to what does that repayment timeline look like? The note should lay out some repayment schedule. The act did not say, does it need to be a balloon note? Does it need to be an amortizing note? So your note will govern what that looks like. The interest rate for everyone was 1%, as we mentioned. And then the other key piece is, you don't have to make any payments for 6 months. And so the thought there was 6 months should give ample time for all the money to get dispersed, forgiveness to be established, and you should know what your unforgiven amount is before you ever actually have to make a payment, and ensure that you don't pay interest or make a payment on amounts that will ultimately be forgiven.
Okay. A couple quick questions. Thank you, Wesley, from our audience. So one question is, we pay our employees on an hourly basis. If you have an employee who used to average 40 hours, but now is only able to work 30 hours a week, can we use the PPP funds to make up those missing 10 hours for that employee? And if so, is that a forgivable use of the funds? Bill or Wesley in particular? Wesley.
Oh, you're pointing to me?
All right, yeah.
Yes. So we've been asked that question in various forms. One is, if I pay someone more, can I pay them a bonus? Can I pay them an hourly wage? What if my hourly wage is higher than what I paid last year? there doesn't appear to be a limitation on how much someone can be paid, on a per hour basis. In this specific example, you've got many people that are sitting at home not doing anything that would be getting paid under this because for whatever reason they can't come in. They're not allowed to come in. The business is closed. And the intent of this was to get folks off the unemployment rolls and pay them through this program. So the only limitation on an upward basis is the $15,385 maximum that's allowed during the covered period for forgiveness.
Okay, so that is forgivable.
And Charlie, this is Woody. Just so everybody knows, that $15,000 amount ties to the $100,000 cap. That's the 8 weeks.
Right.
The equivalent 8 week equivalent of $100,000 annual compensation.
Okay, perfect. Another quick question. So one of the members has been told that, hey, look, if the company's profitable at the end of the year, then forgiveness of the loan may not occur. So is that true? Is it true that if you're profitable, then you're not going to be able to get any loan forgiveness?
I can take that one. There's no guidance that says that's true. That's where we're waiting for the interim final rules and other guidance that comes in. When it first came out, I think you started off, Charlie, talking about big businesses getting the loans. And so they came out with this certification and this safe harbor. This is, I think, a natural follow-on to that said, hey, if you're making money, you don't need the PPP, so it's not going to be forgiven. Maybe you should give the loan back, all sorts of stuff. But I haven't seen any guidance that says that if you made a profit, you can't get your PPP forgiven. Okay.
Another ask, thank you, Bill, on that. And another ask from the members is, hey, can someone just post the form 3508 on the chat room? And if you can't do it while we're chatting, then maybe Corey, we could just make sure that's emailed out to the group just so everyone has access to that.
I'll send that to Corey. And if you want, I can share a copy of it real quick so people can look as you go through the next session. Fantastic.
That'd be helpful. So moving on to the next session, thank you, and particularly Bill and Wesley. We've got a little bit more time, and we want to talk about back to work. So don't be totally distracted by this form as we hit how do you go back to work and do it safely. So I want to pull in Joan McKenna and ask you, Joan, what's the latest guidance from CDC on back to work that the AIA members need to know about? And what can they be doing to prepare to bring back their workforce in compliance with federal legislation?
Sure. Thanks, Charlie. So the CDC, in conjunction with OSHA, have issued a booklet, essentially, but it's online, called the Guidance on Preparing Workplaces for COVID-19. What this document does is remind us that the Occupational Safety and Health Act has what is called the General Duty Clause, which says that all employers are required to provide a workplace that is free from recognized hazards. But OSHA has not implemented any specific black and white rules for businesses at this time in dealing with COVID-19. So that's the good news and the bad news. What they're suggesting that we do is assess our own businesses in terms of the vehicles by which we could recognize our workforce could be exposed to the illness, and then take appropriate remedial action to anticipate those mechanisms of infection. So what the burden is, and again, this guidance booklet, it's very helpful. I would strongly recommend you look at it if you're thinking about bringing people physically back to an office location. The good news also about office locations, such as professional services like yours, like law firms, is that frankly, there's not a lot of public visitation that happens. So much of what we do now is electronic, that we're considered essentially a low risk business under OSHA guidelines. But nonetheless, COVID-19 is a community spread disease. So every time you're in the same room with someone else, there's this potential of exposure, and we just don't know enough about it yet. We also know it can kill. For some people, it's deadly. So what OSHA is recommending that we do is all assess our businesses to determine where these mechanisms are, where do we have public interaction, and what can we do to make sure that people aren't coming into our office space that have active symptoms of COVID-19. And then also with respect to interacting with one another, how can we make sure our employees, if they're back even serially in the same spot, if you have one person followed by another the next day or the next week, how do we prevent the virus from being transmitted from one person to another? What the OSHA guidelines emphasize are that basically all the stuff we've been hearing so far, all employers are going to have an obligation to emphasize basic infection control measures such as hand washing, making antibacterial gel available, making lots of tissue boxes available and trash cans so that people aren't leaving dirty tissues around. I mean, using the sneeze etiquette, all that really common sense stuff, but it's still ironically, in where we are now in this pandemic, that's the best way we can prevent spreading it from one person to another, because we just don't know enough yet about how long it incubates, how long you can be contagious, etc. So going on from there, and in addition to those precautions that we all should be taking anyway, it's going to be an essential part to reopening any of our businesses to think about how can we physically have people in the same space that without creating undue risk. And that's why lots of us are going to look at staggering work shifts, alternating days of work, social distancing in the office, moving desks away from each other, and so on. And again, for businesses like ours, a lot of this is going to be making in-office accommodations to keep people away from each other, to keep people from crowding in rooms together, and from contaminating each other's, not using other people's equipment and so forth. I highly recommend you take a look, Google the CDC return to work guidelines, because they have good general guidance about how you can go about assessing your own business.
So Joan, one of the weird things that a lot of people are seeing is, wow, taking temperatures for people to come back to work and other methods of screening. From an employment law standpoint, are employers, are AIA members allowed to take temperatures, ask employees to fill out questionnaires, return to work questionnaires, and otherwise screen? Has there been any guidance from any of the agencies on the ability to screen your employees before they come back, which can be a very helpful communication to the rest of the workforce, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and part of your planning to reopen or bring people back in, I think it's important to communicate what steps you're taking to keep your employees safe. That's going to help them mentally to grapple with coming back for those who have particular fears of infection. But yeah, it's been really interesting from an employment law perspective to see the ADA interpretation of this pandemic change rules that we've lived and died by for decades, in that you're not allowed to ask. The ADA prohibits conducting medical examinations on employees at various points, and except under very limited circumstances, or from making medical inquiries that could reveal the existence of a disability. Because of the direct threat nature of contagion of COVID-19, because it is deadly, the EEOC has advised that individuals who pose a direct threat to themselves or others in the workplace are not covered by standard ADA protections. And based on CDC, federal, state, and local government guidelines at this time, with all the stay-at-home orders, the orders preventing people from congregating, this is a serious enough pandemic that the existence of a single individual in the workplace is going to be, with COVID-19 or carrying it, is going to be considered to be a direct threat, and you may screen employees coming back to work or visitors to your workplace for whether they have a temperature, whether they're exhibiting any symptoms of COVID-19, and have them fill out questionnaires about whether they have been displaying symptoms of COVID-19. Are they coughing? Do they have a headache? Do they have, body aches, so forth. It just needs to be based in the science. You can't go off track. You can't go off on a fishing expedition. You have to keep it narrowly focused to the information that's available from the CDC and your local government and state governments as to what is considered the most prevalent symptoms. And you may ask those questions, Charlie.
Okay. Thank you, Joan, on that. And Woody, let me transition to you. Before there was any statute, there was this Family First Coronavirus Response Act. are employers right now still eligible to roll that out to their workforce? In other words, could an AIA member's employees right now apply for some kind of leave under the Family First Act?
Yes, and I can give sort of a short overview of it. So yeah, I mean, effective, it was April 1st, effective April 1st, it became applicable to everybody, and it is effective through the end of the year, through 2020. It may be extended at that point, we'll see. But it's in effect, your employees can take advantage of it. What it provides, in short summary, is 80 hours of paid leave for a category of items that consist mostly of, am I seeking a diagnosis for COVID-19? Am I caring for an individual? Doesn't have to be a family member who has COVID-19, or am I taking care of my children who are either out of school or now with school ending, who are not available to go to childcare because childcare is unavailable because of COVID-19. And there's the initial 80 hours, and then that last piece of it, that is the childcare piece of it, or the out of school piece of it, which may come up again in the fall, is there's an additional 10 weeks of leave that's similar to the FMLA leave, or it is under the FMLA, except it just doesn't have the 50-person cap that FMLA has. And you get an additional 10 weeks of leave in that situation, paid again at a different pay rate, 2/3 of pay. But people would be eligible for that leave as well.
Okay, so what about if an employee doesn't want to come in because they're worried about COVID-19? Can they get FMLA leave just because they're worried about coming back to work?
No, we're getting a lot of questions on people who are worried about coming back to work. And I mean, the technical answer is no, you cannot get FMLA leave simply because you're worried to come back to work. Joan will talk a little about ADA accommodations, but on FMLA leave, on anything like that, still, if you've got less than 50 employees and so the FMLA is not applying to you at all, then you don't have to worry about it at all. If somebody has a mental illness that would be a serious health condition, then yeah, you have to think about it. But in general, no, simply worrying about it is not going to qualify as an FMLA basic reason for not coming in. That said, you know, our advice to employers at this point, with all the uncertainties and possible claims out there, is if you can avoid drawing the bright line to where I've got to fire you because you won't come in until we get a little more certainty about how places are going to reopen and the different aspects of this, you know, we've been counseling employers to take that approach versus trying to draw the bright lines at this point.
And Woody, just to follow up on that approach, that kind of interim middle way, is really what we all call in the employment world a furlough. It's a temporary leave of absence. So you're not qualified for leave under the Family Medical Leave Act, or you've exhausted the leave under the Family First Act, but you also don't want to come back because you've got a fear of contracting COVID. We understand. So there's that middle option, which is we're not going to fire you, but we're going to give you a furlough, which is an unpaid leave of absence, right? I mean, that's the gist.
And usually with your health insurance covered, the employer would typically continue your health insurance in that.
So Joan, Woody kind of highlighted what the FMLA says. What about under the ADA? What accommodations does an employer need to make under the ADA if someone is just fearful of coming back to work?
So we've gotten that question a lot because we've gotten a lot of businesses that have contacted us about they have employees who are just afraid to come back and perform their jobs where it's a public intensive type of environment. And the way to analyze that is going to be that you always, as an employer, have an obligation to engage in the interactive process to determine if an individual has a covered disability by the ADA, and if they do, whether there's a reasonable accommodation that you will be required to provide to them. So it's important initially to make the distinction: is this someone who has an underlying condition like both Woody and Charlie have referred to right now? Is it someone who has an anxiety diagnosis or a OCD diagnosis whereby their underlying medical condition will qualify them as a disabled person under the ADA, and they are therefore legally entitled to accommodation by you up to the point of undue hardship? So what we, an EEOC has emphasized to employers at this time, with things being as strange as they are, and everything being so sort of up in the air, and unknowns, a lot of unknowns, and there is a lot of anxiety, frankly, throughout our population about this disease, that we be very liberal in offering accommodation. That does not mean you are legally required to accommodate an individual who does not otherwise have a disability that requires accommodation. If I am perfectly fine with no diagnosis of any sort of diagnosable condition that makes me particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 more than anyone else in the population, you are not required to accommodate them. But if your employee has a diagnosis of something like OCD, anxiety, depression, similar types of conditions, that triggers ADA, and you are required to work with them to determine whether there's an accommodation that's available to them that would enable them to perform the essential functions of their job, but without incurring an undue hardship on your company. And what that can look like today, in this current environment, is being more liberal with teleworking. We've seen that, people are doing that anyway, a lot of teleworking at this time, being more liberal. Obviously there's some jobs that you cannot do remotely. Being more liberal with providing additional PPE if you can get your hands on it. Setting up the workspace in such a way that an individual feels more confident that they are not going to get exposed to anything in the workplace that's any greater than what they'd get by walking down, going about their normal life.
So can you ask, if you're the employer and the employee says, I'm afraid of coming back to work, can you ask for medical certification under the ADA?
Yes, you may, and you should, quite frankly, because that will determine whether you have to. And there is, you can't say, do you have a condition that requires me, to accommodate you? What you can say is, and what we recommend that you say is, you're experiencing what a lot of people are experiencing right now. What I'm going to ask you to do is go to your doctor and have your doctor help us understand do you have a diagnosable condition that we need to be aware of and therefore to accommodate? Or is this a generalized anxiety that frankly 99% of the world is dealing with right now? And then you can ask them to bring you the documentation from their physician proving essentially that they have a disability covered by the ADA.
So that's one bucket of concerns that I'm sure a lot of the members have been receiving from their employees, anxiety-related concerns. What about employees, though, who may be immunocompromised? What if you have a pregnant employee? So what are our members supposed to do then?
I mean, and this is a situation where I think it's more art than science, quite frankly. Pregnancy in and of itself is not a disability covered by the ADA. Pregnancy-related conditions are a disability, but frankly, the CDC seems to be generally treating pregnant women as having particularly, it's a high risk. They don't want them to get infected. So, we would recommend as a best practice to basically go through the accommodation process with the individual if they're pregnant. What the solutions we've given some of our clients so far with people like this, people who are in the age group, over 70 or pregnant or have an immunocompromised condition, that you either allow them to remain furloughed longer or you work with them to see if they can work remotely. I mean, especially for the pregnant women, we have recommended to a lot of our clients, just allow them to stay on leave and allow them to stay furloughed until they have the baby and then reassess where things are at that time. But essentially, with an immunocompromised person, that is most likely someone covered by ADA for whom you have a legal obligation to accommodate their condition. And the reality is, if COVID-19 is more deadly for them because of their disability, then you're going to be required to make accommodations to prevent them getting exposed in the workplace.
So assume for a moment you've gone through this interactive process with the employees. You've done all these accommodations. You're following CDC guidelines and OSHA guidelines. You've got, social distancing and everything in the workplace that you could possibly do. And the employee, you've offered the employee his or her job back. Can they just stay home and collect unemployment once you offer the job back?
No, I mean, basically you must be ready, willing, and able to work in order to be qualified to receive unemployment compensation. So if once someone has offered, and I believe Virginia is one of the states where they're encouraging employers to notify the VEC if they've offered them to come back to work at this point, because VEC needs to know if they're supposed to be going back to work and therefore have forfeited their right to unemployment benefits.
Hey, Charlie, this is Woody. There's a link on the VEC website that allows you to report it.
Yeah, and when Woody and Joan, everyone say VEC, that's the Virginia Employment Commission. They've got a very helpful website. But bottom line is, if you've taken the steps you can, you've engaged in the interactive process, you've offered the employee his or her job back, they can't continue to draw unemployment. They may decide, I'm not coming back, and that's their choice. Or you might reach an accommodation which looks more like a furlough and say, we're going to give you unpaid leave of absence. But it doesn't mean they can continue to draw unemployment when you offer them the job back. We've got a couple of minutes left, just very briefly to hit the last questions that came in. And I'm going to start with one more PPP question, which Wesley or Bill, this is one which says, if the loan is used now for payroll for someone making a base salary of $100,000 or less, but later the person is given a bonus, which puts them over the top. So they go over the $100,000 line for 2020 income. Do we then have to pay back the PPP dollars that were used for that person's income during the 8-week period? Wesley, what do you think?
No, you do not. The maximum salary that's allowed for forgiveness is the $15,385 that we mentioned earlier, which is 8 weeks based on $100,000. And then something we didn't mention is, these employees that are making more than $100,000 are excluded from the the salary reduction calculation, and that's actually based on 2019 payroll and not 2022 to exclude them from that particular calculation. But the key answer here is no, you would not.
Okay, thank you, Wesley. Couple quick ones. Woody, under the Family Medical Leave Act portion of the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, there's a question here. What if the employee is working part-time? So say the employee is working 30 hours in order to do an allowable activity like childcare, right, under that portion? Right. Can the 10 hours, the 10-hour differential, be paid for under the Family First Act? Is that reimbursable? So it's a reduced schedule because they got to take care of the kids.
The short answer is yes. Just like under the FMLA, the intermittent leave aspects can apply to the child care provisions under the FMLA. And so they can take the leave in that manner. And don't forget so two other aspects of the FFCRA. One, the leave you provide, there are tax benefits to some of that. And so be sure that you can get reimbursed, so it's a wash on some of the paid aspects of that. And so be sure to note that. There are exemptions. There's a self-exemption for employers with 50 or fewer employees that if allowing the leave would, and this is just for this child care and school part, if allowing the leave would make it so you cannot conduct your business, then there's an exemption and there's a certain self-certification process. But it's more complicated than that, but just be aware that it's out there, and if you need to take advantage of it, to look into it.
There's one last question, then we're done. I think we hit them all. And this is, if an employee is getting unemployment because they're on furlough, will the employer then be penalized in terms of forgiveness, not be able to get a portion of the loan forgiven for not using PPP funds to make those payments for the hours not worked to care for children. In other words, they're getting paid unemployment, so does that mean they can't get loan forgiveness for that amount paid by state unemployment or federal unemployment under the CARES Act? And I'll just answer it, yes, they can't get it. You're not going to get loan forgiveness if the employer is not paying you if you're drawing unemployment.
Right. I mean, it's, as Wesley discussed earlier, you have to be able to show the amount of payment that you made. So if you got a loan amount for them last year, and that's a part of the PPP loan, if you didn't pay them this year, you're not going to get that forgiven. In fact, it will probably result, if you didn't pay them, you have excess PPP funds that you didn't spend, and you've got the FTE reduction because they're not on your FTE count. So you're going to get a haircut on that on a number of occasions, plus the fact you didn't pay it.
Exactly. Well, with that, Corey, I think we've run out of time, and thank you all for letting us go a little bit beyond our allotted 60 minutes so we can answer all of your questions. I don't think we've quite, I think another one popped up, but we've run out of time, Corey. And
you go ahead. You can go ahead and take this last one if you want to. You can go ahead.
All right, last one? Okay.
Yep.
The question is, if the firm makes its retirement contributions in February, can we consider $852 amount of our contribution incurred and seek forgiveness for this amount? Y'all understand that one, Wesley? You see it?
Yeah, I mean, they're asking whether, even if they'd made their contribution in February for the 8-week time period, can they still get forgiveness of that amount?
Yeah.
Yeah, that one would be, there's no guidance on it except to say that that payment was made before your 8-week period.
Oh, right.
So it would be really tough to say that it's paid, and it doesn't say anything about retirement payments or healthcare payments that are made in the next scheduled period, which would actually be, next year at this time. So it's pretty unclear with respect to that. But Wesley, I don't recall any conversations on that specifically in our meetings.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that in terms of the if there's some sort of if there's an example, if you have a 401k contribution that's coming out in the next regularly scheduled payroll, and it's not necessarily paid during that date, perhaps that could count. But if you've got a significant delay of time there, you've got the incurred piece of things, but it either has to be paid or it has to be paid before the next regular scheduled payroll date is the way we're currently reading the act. That's outside those windows.
If you want to get your 850 seconds in, if you do the calculations during the period and make that payment before the end of the 8 weeks, you'd be able to show that it was incurred during this period and the payment made during this period for the retirement. That would probably be the best way to do it. But if I've already made the payment, it's going to be really hard pressed to come in to try to get that in as a part of the forgiveness calculation.
Exactly.
Hey, Charlie, let me say one quick thing on the furlough question. There is an FAQ, and there is a process to where if you've got somebody on unemployment and they refuse to come back to work, and you make a written offer to them and they still don't come back to work, that you don't get penalized under the full-time equivalent process. So I just didn't want the implication to be that there's not a way out of that scenario. So just so people are aware of that.
Thank you, Woody. With that, Corey, we really appreciate the chance to chat with your members and be with you. And we're here to answer any other questions that people may have following this presentation. Thank you very much.
You bet. And Charlie, thank you. I think after your career in law, you can do this full time as a moderator. So job well done, my friend. And Woody and Joan, thank you for offering your legal advice. And I would say to my friends, Bill and Weston, I see Paul has snuck online as well. Thank you for sharing your time and talents from the accounting side. And please, I will share my thankfulness to the Virginia Society of CPAs for allowing you to be with us as well. To those that are still on the line, if you're navigating through this process again and you come up with other questions on the legal side, whether it's through employment law or again through navigating the PPP forgiveness piece, I clicked and copied and pasted the link to our legal aid. Again, you have a free 30-minute consultation at your disposal as an AIA member to help you navigate through this. And I encourage you to use it. So until then, my friends, I hope you found this valuable, and I look forward to serving you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Corey. All right, Paul,
Thanks.
good to see you.